So today I figured I would just kind of talk my way through a couple of the paintings in the show here. Maybe we could even like move around, and we all kind of got like our standing spots here, and that's okay, but we can maybe organically try and move around the space a bit. And I look for this to be maybe even more of a conversation at times, so don't be shy at any point if you have a question or you want to offer some of your own insight or how some of this might relate to your experience with the forest around here. Don't be shy to chat or bring something up. But to start, I wanted to point out the magic that is the forest, which is what this painting here is called magic, right? Because as terrible as all this other stuff happening out there can be, I think it's important to like ground ourselves in the fact that a lush, thriving, old growth, ancient forest ecosystem is exactly that. It is magic, right? Where things are growing on top of each other, where there's nurse logs of 1,000-year-old trees sprouting 100-year-old trees, and there's every type of bug and deer and bear and cougar, and so many animals. There's people that live off this land. There's us that go there to recreate, right? It's total magic. It's overgrown with flowers. There's so many things that you can eat. There's medicine all over the place. You can like mush two plants together and make something that tastes like something you've never experienced before, or some kind of medicine to heal something that you didn't know that you had an ailment for, right? The forest is magic. Now, I'm not against all logging. Obviously, we need timber products. So there's ways that we can manage our forests that are responsible forest management, right? That could be selective logging or rotational logging of second, third, fourth, fifth growth forests. But the fact that we continue to cut down less than 3% that remain of our untouched old growth ancient forest is insane, right? That's totally crazy. The most magic of the magic forests, less than 3% of them, we are still rushing to cut down as a society, from a government level down. And that's crazy. And again, conservation financing, like what NBSF does, that's the best, most effective way to protect these forests, but there's a lot of other pieces to the puzzle. Sometimes that's activism, which is how I first got invested in trying to figure out what the conservation puzzle looked like here, what the permanent protection puzzle looked like. NBSF is going to protect the forest forever, in perpetuity going forward. A blockade, like what's pictured here, well, that can save a forest for maybe an afternoon, or maybe sometimes a week or two, or a summer. Like in the case of the Fairy Creek blockades, where I first had my first experience living at a blockade, where I lived there for 4 months. That summer, there was over 1,200 arrests. It was the largest act of civil disobedience in Canadian history. And there was all these performative things that people did to try and stop the cutting happening literally that day, right? The Supreme Court of BC, they had an injunction against the land defenders, myself and some of the people in this room included. And it was the RCMP's job to come and do all kinds of crazy things like load themselves onto backloaders or show up in the middle of the night dressed as green militarized army men and scare us and spook us, steal our stuff, break our stuff, right? And all that we were trying to do is get in the way of the saws, because conservation hadn't done their work to get to some of these areas yet. They hadn't had their time to work with the Indigenous community yet to implement the Indigenous community's own protection plan, right? This stuff takes a long time. It requires a lot of funding. It requires a lot of private funding too. So in our job out there, the blockades, it was stop the saws today. And it often looked like this. We'd build these tripods. People would climb all the way up to the top of the tripod with a carabiner kind of rope system. They'd plunk themselves up there, and they would wait. Because obviously, if the police come and they cut the leg of the tripod, well, then that person is going to fall and get injured or worse. We can't have that happening. So we would just do whatever we could. People would lock themselves into the ground. They would climb up into trees, tree sits. They'd climb up into the biggest, oldest trees in the grove and just wait. They'd do whatever they could to stop the saws from happening that day. And that's important too, right? There's up at Cougar Camp, it was called last summer, in the Walbrand, there's camps still going on that are dormant right now because it's not quite cut in season yet, but this is still happening today. There still are people giving up some of their civil liberties to try and protect the magic that is the forest, because the conservation hasn't quite caught up yet with the government. So there's somewhere in the middle of all this, there's a web that's kind of being knit of how we can get to a more immediate protection plan. In my second year out at a blockade with Rufus here, who's in a number of the paintings today as well, somebody that I met out at Eden Camp my first year at the Fairy Creek blockades on unceded Pachidot territory. Well, our second year, we went out to a place called Sasson Camp, which was on unceded Dididot territory, a little bit to the north of Pachidot. And we lived at the blockade for a little while, not nearly as long as we did at Eden Camp, because unfortunately the RCMP, they got a lot better at messing with us. And they got a lot better at preventing the blockade tactics from happening. But we did our best the second year at Sasson Camp, and it didn't work. Now, the forest that's being protected by the tripod in this painting, it still is standing today. But at Sasson Camp that next year, well, that forest is now clear cut. And there's a painting at the top of the stairs there with a big rainbow in it that maybe you could check out later after the talk here, that shows that forest the following summer when Rufus and I went back and visited it. Well, it was an active clear cut. So we were able to see it through these multiple stages of what it looks like living at a blockade, what that forest looks like as a thriving ecosystem full of ancient trees. The following summer, what it looks like as an active clear cut. We waited until about 4 in the afternoon that day when the cutting was done. And we hiked in, and it was a heat dome. It was like 45 degrees outside. There's just jerry cans of fuel left all around. There's saws out. There's like lunch pails and stuff. You know, the loggers are just left all their garbage around while they're cutting these massive 4-meter wide trees in some cases. That was, of course, heartbreaking to see this forest we tried to save but couldn't. But in that process of watching a forest disappear, I think that we both would say that we feel we have a responsibility to that land now, to keep an eye on it, to go and check up on it regularly, to see what's happening, not just when it's an active clear cut, but then the following summer where we went back and now it's just a rotting, decomposing hole in the earth where everything has turned gray, right? All the tree parts are decomposing and pushing all the carbon back into the atmosphere that they once stored. It's all gross. There's like a lonely bear trying to find some scraps of berries that, of course, there were none there, right? Like when these forests are still standing, they store more carbon per hectare than even the Amazon rainforest can. To see it in this state of decomposition is heartbreaking for so many different reasons. And then just a few months ago, in the last summer, in July and August, well, I went back again, feeling like I still had this responsibility to go and check up on Sasson. And it didn't quite look like that. Admittedly, there's some imagining going on in this painting. But what I saw while I was there is, well, there's these things called slash piles that the loggers create, which is all the junk that they don't want. When an old cedar hits the ground, it often explodes, right? It's old and rotted inside. So tree parts go everywhere. Or all the little trees that they couldn't use or weren't economically viable, well, they just scrap all those together and they make them into these giant slash piles. And in some cases, they're as tall as this room is. They're just infinitely tall, massive piles of rotting, decomposing tree carcasses. And last summer when I was there, well, those slash piles had started to spontaneously combust. Maybe you see that on farmers' fields sometimes, right? When farmers make like a big pile of weeds, and then they leave it to rot in the sun over the course of the whole summer. And then eventually that rot gets really hot and it sparks, and then you have a flaming pile of grass in the middle of a farmer's field, which isn't really gonna harm too much necessarily. But when it's a 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5-story tall slash pile in the middle of an old growth forest in an incredibly remote area of Vancouver Island, well, we wonder where all these wildfires keep starting from, right? And there's lots of causes for wildfire. But maybe one of them is decomposing, rotting, spontaneously combusting slash piles, which is something that is starting to happen in this province on Vancouver Island. All the slash piles there, they're all in different states of spontaneous combustion. Some of them had burnt right down to holes in the earth. Some of them were kind of half burnt, but they all had that same pattern of black holes punched through the slash pile where you could look in and see that they were burning from the inside out. And the biggest one that I've climbed up on the last few years now, it had all those black holes and was burning all throughout it. So I climbed up on top of it and saw what that felt like. It was the first time that I started really collecting stuff from the forest to paint with. So I collected a whole bunch of charred wood, charred cedar parts from the decomposing, self-combusting slash pile. I collected deer bones. There's a bunch of charred deer bones that they'd throw it into the slash pile too. All the fireweed, the first flower, the first plant that grows back after a fire comes through. There's fireweed all around these slash piles. I collected a bunch of those flowers and started drying them and crushing them up and mixing them into the paint, sand from the logging road beside the slash pile. And all that is literally in this painting. So this painting is Sasson, of Sasson, with Sasson, you know, trying to just kind of like close the circle on a painting being a whole ecosystem that is kind of contained or stored within the material on the surface of the canvas in the paint. So what do we got to do about all that? Well, I don't know. Again, I'm only one guy. There's only so much that folks like myself and other forest protectors can do. Which is why, again, coming back, I keep wanting to ground this conversation in the permanent conservation and conservation financing, in folks like Emily at NBSF, who are going to work directly with the First Nations to make sure that these type of things don't happen, that there is responsible forest management, that there's permanent protection for these lands in a way that is just as economically viable for the Indigenous communities whose territory this land is on. We've got pamphlets all around here that say Art Auction for Old Growth Autumn if you want to take one of those. You can learn more about the charity and what we're doing. But yeah, I just wanted to talk about one more painting maybe. And then if anybody else wants to hear about a painting in specific, maybe we could keep the conversation open from there. But the more time that I've done this work, the more time that I've been out in the forest and seen fire with my own eyes or seen things like spontaneously combusting slash piles, the more that I've wanted to try and investigate wildfire for myself, to try and go and see what that looks like up close too. That's another condition of the land right now that's scary and accelerating. We're supposed to have another crazy hot El Nino summer, hotter than ever. I heard that 2 weekends ago it was already over 90 degrees in mountainous parts of the States like Colorado, right? And it's coming for us any day now, I'm sure. So last summer, the research trip that I went on for almost 3 months with Liz here and Rufus here was not just to places like Sasson, but also to go and try and find some of these wildfire sites in really remote parts of the country. And that's how we ended up in Wells, BC, which is in this painting over here. That's the title painting from the show. We could have been a mountain. And Wells is this incredibly strange town in the Caribou district where there's these big red signs on the side of the trail that tell you don't leave the trail because the soil is so contaminated with arsenic and lead and other heavy metals that if you have your dog or you or your dog stray off the trail, you're going to poison yourself because the logging and the mining in this town for so many years, for so many generations now, has completely decimated the land all around it. And we specifically went there. Liz had been there before and knew that there had been a big wildfire just the summer earlier, where about 15,000 hectares were burned in what was just called the Wells wildfire. And we had a hunch that something was going on there that we wanted to go investigate. Something called salvage logging, which is this incredibly destructive, ridiculous practice of cutting down burnt or bug-infested trees to try and salvage any saleable timber that's left inside of those dying trees. Now, in some cases, maybe there's a reason for that, right? Maybe it's like near a community, you don't want them falling on houses or roadways or whatnot. But way out in the middle of nowhere, it's insult to injury, right? And we followed up with foresters on this trip that explained this to us concisely, right? Like the falling dead trees, the burnt trees, if they're just going to fall naturally, well, they're going to recycle themselves back into the soil. They're going to give places for birds and bears and deer and everything to live, owls, whatnot, birds to live off the land. They're going to keep that soil real fertile so that a new forest is going to grow back there. But when we salvage log a forest, there's nothing there. It's a literal hole in the earth. Nothing is ever going to grow there again. So we went to Wells to go and see this wildfire site and go and see what the salvage looked like for ourselves up close. And it was, of course, just as gross and upsetting and devastating as you might think it is to see a black, burnt down forest being actively logged. But on the night that Liz and I in particular were hiking this salvage logging site, again, after the loggers went, we've gotten pretty good at timing when loggers finish their day. We hiked in and we saw all the gross stuff happening. We saw the machinery. And an electrical storm was forming over our heads, and we could hear it. There's lightning off in the distance. There's thunder happening. And we timed it perfectly. After about 15 minutes of hearing the lightning or hearing the thunder and seeing the lightning, we jumped back in the truck just at the moment it started downpouring. Total downpour, crazy rain for about 15 minutes. And then the rain stopped, but the lightning didn't. And that's a new condition with climate change that's happening more and more regularly in Canada. These rainless electrical storms, which in addition to spontaneously combusting slash piles, seems like a pretty good way to start some wildfires in some remote parts of the country. So the next morning, we woke up to an alert on our phone from the mayor of Wells saying that a new wildfire had started overnight as a result of the lightning. And that kind of became the focus of our whole life, really, for the next 2 or 3 days that we were there, just completely immersed in this wildfire. We drove out to the valley where the wildfire had started. We're at a safe distance. Of course, we don't want to get in the way of the wildfire fighters who are working hard to try and put out this fire. So we're on the opposite side of the valley. We're looking across this deep valley, watching the wildfire burn, watching the crews do their work. And the thing that I remember most about that day with you two was like just being quiet, honestly, like not talking to each other very much. Like, of course, we talked a little bit, but just kind of standing, watching a forest burn itself out, all the smoke plumes and stuff like that, right? Like, what are you going to say? We went back to where we were staying at the end of the day of watching the fire in the valley, and we reset and had a beer and a dinner. And one of the things that we knew is on particularly windless nights, if there's a wildfire happening, the crews will often just let it burn itself out. That it's not at risk of really spreading, right? If there's no wind, it's better to let the forest burn in on itself and all the fuel, all the biomass that's in the middle of the fire. It's better to just let it burn out, and then the crews will come back first thing in the morning and start working to put out the fire, hopefully with less to burn in the middle of the fire. So we thought, well, let's try and see how close we can get to the fire now that there's no crews that we're going to get in the way of. And we waited till midnight or so. And we first drove back to that first spot on the far side of the valley where we were watching the fire earlier in the day. And it was a totally different scene, right? During the day, you can see some of the orange maybe, but it's mostly just smoke, a whole bunch of smoke plumes. But at night now it's pulsing orange. It's like glowing red. It's very vibrant. And I remember standing in mostly silence and taking photos and watching this happen. And then at some point, I think we all collectively were like, well, how close can we get? So we drove back down the valley and then back up the switchback to try and get into the middle of the fire, which in hindsight maybe sounds like a pretty crazy idea, but seemed important to do in the moment. And the thing that I remember the most about that experience was as we're doing the switchback up the hill to get to the fire, I had the sensation that it was the fire that was moving and not our truck. Because it was so alive, right? Like the switchback turns pretty sharp, and there's the canopy of the trees that haven't yet burnt in between us and the fire, and you go around a turn and the fire's on the right. And then we go around another turn, and now the fire is still on the right, but we've turned, and I couldn't really make sense of that. And then the fire was right in front of us, and then all of a sudden the fire was below us. And I couldn't quite figure out how that had totally happened. I was like a little bit disoriented in the space. And eventually we get to a bridge, a small logging bridge, that was crossing a waterfall that wasn't there anymore. The waterfall had dried out by that point. The bridge is very narrow, one of the smallest logging bridges I've ever been on, just as wide as the truck that we were in was wide. And we drove across, and as soon as we get on the other side of the bridge, all of the dirt, the road, the forest on the other side was covered in this red, silty, pillowy, foamy stuff. And I didn't know exactly what was going on, but I remember Liz from the back seat suggesting quite urgently that we needed to turn around. We couldn't see anything because there's smoke everywhere. It's the middle of the night. There's the red stuff all around the truck. So the part about that moment that stuck the most in my head is all of us, I remember like pushing our faces against the glass of the truck windows because we couldn't open the window because of the smoke to try and guide the truck backwards across this very narrow bridge. And maybe it took us a couple of minutes. In my mind, it took us an hour to back across that bridge. And then afterwards, I remember immediately checking in with each other and being like, what the fuck just happened? And then finding a spot where the smoke had kind of was in the opposite direction. We got out and we took some more photos and everything was fine. Then we got back to where we were staying that night, and Liz, who's done some wildfire fighting training, suggested to us that when there's a fresh wildfire retardant drop like that, which is what we drove it out onto, the red pillowy stuff, the wildfire retardant, well, one of the things that you should never do is drive onto that, because there's a chance that the ground underneath the retardant drop is still smoldering, even though the fire around it might be out, and you were afraid we were going to blow the tires out of my truck. I'm glad that you didn't tell me that in the moment. Since then, we've talked a lot about this, the three of us, and I think that we all maybe wish we had pushed a little bit further. Who knows what would have happened to my truck, but I know that you've reconciled this in painting, and here, that's what I'm doing too. So yeah, all of this to say, we got to do something. Right? Old growth forests are fire resistant. These big old trees, they store tons of moisture. It's good for an old growth forest to burn out the understory, and all the big trees stay standing, right? So we can protect these old forests. That means less fire. It means there's just going to be less fire. It means there's going to be less carbon in the atmosphere. That means that our summers aren't going to be as hot. There's all kinds of trickle-down effects that are good for the environment if we just simply work to protect the last less than 3% of our endangered old growth forests. Yeah, so there was a painting in my first show at Bau-Xi 5 or so years ago at Bau-Xi, Toronto, that was another painting of the blockade imagery. So there's, as I was saying earlier, tripods and all that type of stuff, but one of the main mechanisms for blocking a logging truck is something called a sleeping dragon. The sleeping dragon is where you dig a giant hole in the earth in the middle of the logging road, and at the bottom of the hole you put a tire usually, and you fill it full of rebar. Am I giving away too much, Rufus? Exactly, yeah. There's lots of writing about this. You fill a hole with a tire filled with rebar and cement, and in the middle often you'll cement a big metal pipe, and at the bottom of the pipe you put a clip, usually a carabiner, and then you fill all the dirt back in, so from the ground, and then you put a big rock on top. So from the ground, it looks like nothing has happened. It just looks like a regular logging road. But when the loggers come, you move the rock that's on top of the metal pipe, and you stuff your armpit deep into the earth, and you have a carabiner on a metal chain around your hand, and you clip yourself to the bottom of the rebar-filled tire with the metal pipe in the middle. So the loggers of the RCMP can't pull you out of the earth and move you. You are literally locked to the earth so that the loggers can't move their trucks up the road and cut the trees. And that was one of the most striking things that I saw at Eden Camp, where I lived at the Fairy Creek blockades. Our camp there was rated in such a way that was novel at the time. We were kind of the first camp that had the surge, CIRG, the militarized RCMP force, come in the middle of the night and mess with all of our stuff. And then arrests started happening first thing in the morning. All the arrests before that were much more processional and formal and happened in the daylight. But as a result of that, it meant that of all the tactics at Eden Camp, only one was able to be utilized, and that was a sleeping dragon. One person was able to get their arm locked into the road right at the top of the gate at Eden. And I was there that day and took literally 1,000 photographs of that happening and knew that I needed to make a painting of that. But how was I going to show that somebody had locked it just looked like somebody was laying on the road. So this idea of a subterranean layer made its way into my work. And in that painting, Sleeping Dragon, it showed Mackie, the forest protector that was in the dragon, underneath the ground, their body above the ground, that subterranean layer. And then underneath the ground, instead of just being locked into a metal pipe, Mackie was holding on to one of the roots of one of the old growth trees, and the roots were extending underneath the logging road. So that was just an organic process. I was trying to solve a compositional problem in the painting. And then over the last several years now, I've realized that there's so many other ways that I can employ that subterranean layer as a means to show what's happening under the water or what's happening under the soil. Or the painting up in the front there has a subterranean layer as well in the front window of fish, right? Like activating fish, showing that all these things are connected. Like you're suggesting, like damage to the soil, damage to the water, damage to the mountainside, all of these things are connected. We got to think about, like a term that you hear all the time is like sustainable farming, sustainable land practice. Like when there's nothing left to sustain, well, what's the point of talking about sustainability? We need to be thinking about regenerative land stewardship practices. And I think that that subterranean land has been a really useful way for me to show that all of these things are connected. And in order to regenerate the land that's on fire, well, we also need to think about the things that are happening under the water and under the soil. What I continue to learn and continue to have reinforced is that there is no one-size-fits-all answer in these regards. Every nation, certainly in BC, has different agreements with extractionist industry. There are Indigenous-owned logging companies and resource extraction companies, everything in between. Some nations want to cut their land because they think that's the most economically profitable way for them to move forward. Some of them really don't, and it's just, there is no one-size-fits-all answer, and there kind of is no one easy answer to how all of this network of territories bumping into each other and the different tree farm licenses that are sold and who they're sold to and which logging company owns the tree farm license versus which nation has sold it. And it's just a big web, which is, again, coming back to why NBSF is so effective and important, is because they work directly with the nations to say, hey, what do you need? What would you like your land to be? How do you imagine your land kind of being the most economically beneficial to you, the most culturally beneficial to you? Some are going to prioritize fishing practices. Some are going to prioritize recreation, right? So I don't really have one straightforward answer for you just because of the mix that is land rights management in BC. That's about all I got to say for now. But if there's anything else you'd like me to chat about, or anything else that you'd like to add, or anything from your own experience that you'd like to share, I'd be very happy to keep talking.